Listen up, Democrats. You like fake news. Six lines of facts. Save our democracy from right-wing hypocrisies. People rejecting and race our diversity. We always come back to listen up, Democrats.
Hello, welcome to People for Democratic Party Reform. My name is Larry Taylor. If you would like to submit questions for today's show, you can type them into the chat window, and we will do our best to get those questions relayed to the guest today and get them answered. The title of today's show is Found Democracy in the Heart of Dixie, and it's about how Alabama Democrats reformed their party. Our guests today are Selena Vickers and Julia Juarez. Selena, welcome.
Thank you.
And Julia, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So to start out, perhaps you could give us a little introduction on your background and how you got involved, and then we'll go to the clip. So we'll start with Selena.
Well, I'm from West Virginia, and I was a delegate for Senator Bernie Sanders in 2016. And like many delegates, we were very, very disappointed with a lot of things at the convention. One of the good things that came out of the convention, though, was the Unity Reform Commission. And I West Virginia basically went completely to Bernie Sanders, but superdelegate. Clinton won West Virginia because of superdelegates. And so I kind of dug into the rules and advocated for that. And that took me on a very, very long journey into rules and bylaws meetings and things like that. And then along the way, I met Julia and learned about the Alabama story, which is a very, very inspiring story, which we'll talk about more throughout the hour.
Excellent. And Julia, tell us about your background.
So I live in Vermont, or I live in Alabama. I'm from Vermont originally. I've been here about 20 years. 2016, I was a super volunteer for Bernie's campaign. Pretty much worked with everybody all over the state and jumped in with both feet. So after we, of course, lost Alabama because it's Alabama, I decided to stay involved with all the Democrats and the people and the progressives that I had gotten to know. And I actually got appointed onto the state Democratic Executive Committee. I figured I had my feet already in there, so I might as well go all the way into the Democratic Party and see what I could do to try to help change it and make it more progressive from the inside. And then a whole lot of mess and drama sort of dropped in my lap. So I got involved in that and stayed involved in it.
Excellent. So to set the stage for today's story, we're going to show you a news clip from earlier. So Oz, let's play the news clip, and then we'll go into the backstory.
This afternoon, I spoke with Alabama Democratic Party Chairwoman Nancy Worley. She tells me she plans to fight to keep her position. This afternoon, the Credentials Committee of the Democratic National Committee passed a motion calling for new elections in the Alabama Democratic Party. This comes after members of the minority caucus say they didn't have the proper credentials and weren't allowed to vote for party chair last August. The DNC's decision will affect the elections of Chairwoman Nancy Worley and Vice Chair Randy Kelly. This was our interview with Nancy Worley back in November, when many in the party called for her to step down following November's election results.
We always do what we think is in the best interest of the party.
We spoke by phone with Nancy Worley, who is currently in Washington, D.C. She says she's disappointed but hopes this matter can be resolved soon.
I'm obviously disappointed in the results, but quite frankly, it will be an opportunity for us to lay all the questions to rest. It will be an opportunity to make sure everybody's wearing a lanyard and their credentials can't be questioned.
Putting the Valley first, Rashad Hudson, WZDX News.
So that sets up the story for today. So let's talk about how you discovered that there was a problem, and then what did you start doing about it? Julie, would you like to share?
Sure. So the problem actually began at the last election of the SDC officers. So after the last midterm elections, we had an entirely new slate of SDC members. And then we're supposed to elect the new officers for the party. The problem was that the chairperson is incredibly disorganized, and she basically tromps all over parliamentary rules and does whatever she wants, basically. There's a section of our state party, which is the minority caucus. This is primarily Black officials or Black people that are included into the party. There was a consent decree back in the 80s or 90s because there was not sufficient Black representation on the state party, and there weren't enough Black people that were being elected into these seats, which was completely unfair considering 70% of the electorate in Alabama for the Democratic Party are Black. So there was a court decree that said that there had to be a minimum amount elected, and if there were not, then they could be appointed at large to these seats. The minority caucus gets to nominate those people to be put onto the SDC as at-large seats. So the problem came in that the additional at-large members were added to the caucus or to the executive committee, but at the time that they did it, there was zero oversight. There was zero, nobody checked who they were. They didn't give them lanyards. They didn't give them credentials. They just sort of added a whole bunch of people into the people that were in the voting body at this officer election meeting. We didn't really know who they were or who had been elected or how many additional people had been added in that actually lived within the state of Alabama. We had no idea. It was completely disorganized.
Sorry.
It was absolutely horrible. And we tried challenging it while we were in the meeting. There were people that stood up. I was one of them. Chris England was another one who is now the chair. But at the time, he's just a member, and he was like, hey, this is completely disorganized. We have no idea who these people are, where they live, what part of the
We lose her sound?
I think we did.
Julia, your sound.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. So there was a lot of questions and challenging within the meeting itself. And the chair just completely overrode everything and said, we're going to go ahead and do it the way I told you we're going to do it. And we don't care what you have to say about it. So after the meeting, a bunch of people had gotten together because they'd been having some issues with the fact that the party was so disorganized for so long. And they said, we need to file an actual challenge with the DNC to point out all these problems that we're having within just basic functionality of the party in the state. And I was asked to sign on to that challenge as an SDEC member.
Fascinating. So Selena, let's talk about how you got involved.
So I had been going to Unity Reform Commission meetings, and then after the Unity Reform Commission finished their report, they handed off the report to Rules and Bylaws Committee Rules and Bylaws Committee. I started going and live streaming those, and then in the process, there was a challenge that Puerto Rico filed. They did not win their challenge, but I, regularly Google DNC and want to know what's going on with it. Well, it was in January of 2019, and I Googled DNC, and I read about there was an article about the challengers and Alabama, and I feel like Puerto Rico really, really got screwed over, and I sort of assumed that Alabama would too. So Julia's name was mentioned in the challenge, and so I got on Facebook and tried to track her down, and then somehow or another we connected on Facebook and talked, and then she put me in touch with her lawyer. I gave them everything I knew about Puerto Rico, but what ended up happening, the thing that Alabama had going for them that Puerto Rico didn't, is the politics. And while we'll talk a lot about the rules and the challenges, and that's important, the fact of the matter is Alabama kind of had the politics on their side. They had Doug Jones, that was their senator, that was supportive of this challenge, and that really helped, I think, fast track this. But what is really important to know is the thing about both Julia and myself is that we go to these public meetings and we live stream the meetings. And that's not always an easy thing to do because people don't, for some reason, there are some Democrats that don't understand that these are public meetings. They will push back with you. They will say mean things about you. I was accused of being a Russian spy because I dared attend a public DNC meeting and sit quietly and live stream and then advocate with them on breaks about what I wanted. Julia, I'm sure, could talk about some of the pushback that she's received. But, you know, the fact that she or somebody there live streamed and had a recording of the proceedings and what happened at that meeting was key. And we'll see that a little bit later in a clip where one of the DNC members is talking about the chaos. And it's one thing to say it and be he said, she said, but because there was actual physical, recordings of this, what happens, then it really, really helps with the challenges and with the process.
So the first clip that you shared with us seemed to be on a different issue, correct? And so we have a short clip that shows the DNC Rules Committee dispositioning that.
This is Credentials Committee.
Credentials Committee of the DNC.
Yes.
Okay.
Is the one that denial.
So could we show that clip first, Oz? And this is from what year?
This was in 2019.
Sorry. We did have a formal challenge just for the committee that the staff received from Oklahoma State Sheriff's Credentials. This challenge, however, was not properly filed and as such been dismissed.
So it sounds, so what was the technicality that they dismissed the challenge on?
I have no clue. I would love to see that challenge. That's all they said. That's all they said. But that was actually from a recording that I did at the Credentials Committee that was in San Francisco in August of 2018. And they had just removed the credentials of Nancy Worley and Randy Kelly. They removed their credentials as DNC members. And this is all because of the challenge that Julia and the other challengers filed. But the reason that I wanted you to see that clip is to see how incredibly easy it is for them to dismiss. I mean, all they said about, it doesn't matter. I mean, I have no clue what that was about. It could have been, they participated, did the most horrible things, but because it was not properly filed, none of it's out, none of it got discussed. And so the importance of properly filing a challenge in the certain time limits and all that stuff is really, really important.
We had a similar experience. Someone from our state party filed a challenge to the way the delegate selection plan had been handled. And there was this feeling that the DNC was sympathetic and they would listen to our poor story and side with us, but we were dismissed about as efficiently and quickly as yours was. So interesting. So what's the next segment of the story?
When you watch the videotape of the meeting of 11 August 2018, it makes the Keystone Cops look organized. It is chaotic. The parliamentary decisions made by the presiding officer were off the wall and off the charts. So what we propose as the third key element to our proposals was the inclusion of what I would call some standard parliamentary procedures and other protections.
So this was great to hear. It's great to hear support for democracy and parliamentary procedures at this level. What is the background to this clip? Was this to a successful challenge that you submitted?
This was to the challenge that we had filed about the August 11th officer meeting. There was a video that was made, and to go back to Selena's point about how important it is chaotic it was, but for them to be able to watch the video and see the absolute insanity that it was for themselves, it makes it even more difficult to just deny the fact that it was just terrible.
Yes, and it's a very, very good point about parliamentary procedure. Like I remember when I was younger, going to meetings, and then somebody make a big deal about parliamentary procedure, and I remember thinking, oh, how stuffy. Why can't people just talk? But the fact of the matter is, parliamentary procedure is so incredibly important to democracy and to have this fair process. And it can be stuffy and difficult, but the bottom line is it makes it a fair process for people to participate in. And what if Julia had not had that videotape to share, then that video right there was from the Rules and Bylaws Committee when they were debating this and they were trying to figure out how they were going to move forward with this challenge, which ended up being changing their bylaws. And that was Harold Ickes, who was very involved with Alabama. And he, in the process of working with their bylaws, they built in these certain protections around, Parliament having procedure, appropriate procedure. But if they had not had that video to show how the presiding officer just dismissed people's calls for calls for order and for questions and things like that. If they had not seen that, then they would not necessarily, I think, been as motivated to make the changes that they did.
Wow. And our central committee here in our state is trying to ram through a rule that prevents anyone from video recording the proceedings of the meeting.
Oh, you got to stop that.
Yeah,
yes, we're trying. So then what happened?
Final point on everything that's been said. This is the result of two challenges. This is not something that we just got up and decided to undertake. This is in response to two challenges, and so that sort of needs to stay at the forefront of everybody's thinking. This was the result of two challenges.
So what's the background on this clip?
Okay, so that is Yvette Lewis. She also was appointed sort of a bit of a monitor. Her and Harold Ickes were kind of monitors who went down to Alabama. And I think she's the chair of Maryland, I believe. But what the point of that clip is to, now I think what she meant by that, I think she was, the DNC people, they do not like to get involved in state party politics at all. I mean, they want to run their convention. They want to elect a president. This in the weed stuff, they do not want to do. And so I think that what she was trying to say is, look, guys, this isn't something we really want to do, but there were challenges and we had to. But what we need to know, what the average person needs to know, is that if you do not do a proper challenge, it will go nowhere. In West Virginia, you just would not believe how corrupt things are in terms of how the Democratic Party works in West Virginia. Okay. And I've been trying, but it does not, Oz is like all about that. But the fact of the matter is, I had been going for several years and asking, I noticed that the bylaws say this, could you please follow these rules, and then, we'll do that. And then nobody does it. You go to the DNC and tell them what's going on. There's meetings without proper notice and different things like that. Nobody cares. Right. And when I discovered this challenge process, and discovered, how Alabama got things done, and maybe later, if we have time, we can talk about the challenges in West Virginia, which are pending before the DNC right now. But before I started filing challenges, nothing got done. And I know that people in Alabama complained and never got anything done. So the power is in knowing the rules and using the rules to file proper challenges. And I want to be really clear that we're not asking people to do, I call it reform, but it's really not reform. These are rules that have been on the books from the beginning. I'll show you in the clip, in the slide later. Some of the things that Julia and them fought for and finally got in 2019 are things that are in the charter from 1974. So these are not new. Let's change the party. This is follow the rules that you have.
So it sounds like the party then accepted the challenge, and then they did something to get things cleaned up in Alabama. So what was it specifically that the party did to to get things back on track?
So you take that one.
Sure. So what the party did was they removed Nancy's credentials as the chairperson, and they set up a process to allow us to hold a new election for the chairperson. In order to do that, one of the stipulations was that we needed to pass new bylaws that included the information that is required to be in compliance with the national bylaws. That included the parliamentary information, but it also included representation for minorities other than Blacks. That it's very important that we have the Black representation as 70% of the state of Alabama, but we also need to include Hispanics, LGBTQ, Native Americans, Asian Americans, youth. The youth caucus is also incredibly important. So all of these different caucuses that were populations that were not being represented whatsoever within our bylaws, all of that was needed to be included in our new bylaws, which then had to be passed by the SDEC, and then we could hold an election to, if Nancy got elected, then she got elected, and if she didn't, then we elected somebody else. So these were all the requirements that the DNC put in place for us to be able to address the challenge that we had filed with them. There was a whole lot that went into making sure that we could even get the bylaws passed, because Nancy refused to hold a challenge, or she refused to hold a meeting. According to the Alabama bylaws, the only person that can call a meeting is the chairperson, or there's a stipulation that was in there that 50% plus one of the SDEC members could call for a meeting ourselves. We didn't need the chairperson to call for it. Because it was in the bylaws, we were able to use that to organize a meeting that we got 50% of the SDEC members that were already on the books as SDEC members plus one, and we called for a meeting, had a quorum according to the bylaws, the existing previous bylaws that were there, and we were able to remove Nancy as the chairperson with a vote from the floor at this official called SDEC meeting.
This all sounds so familiar for things that we had in our state. No, very interesting. So then let's show, Selena, shall we show the next clips and show the result of the reorganization and the elections?
Yes.
Okay, let's show the final clips.
172 voted yes to remove Nancy as chair, 0 opposed.
Wow, it looked like people were really happy with finally making change in the state.
It was a very exciting time. Yeah, it was quite a historic moment. People had been working on stuff, trying to get these things reformed within the party for decades. So it was a big moment.
And has it made a change in the Alabama party itself?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So we had some other issues that we had to deal with. For example, Nancy sued us because she didn't want us to hold the meeting, first of all. That went to a midnight calling of the Alabama Supreme Court, who is all Republicans, and they said, you can go ahead and have your meeting, because she was trying to block us from having a meeting. So that legal issue carried over for months, because the local judge that had it was a friend of all of the people that were in power in the Democratic Party previously. And so he just delayed and delayed and delayed. So we finally gotten that legal challenge dismissed, because the DNC stepped in and said, hey, we need to be a part of this lawsuit because we're named in it, so we need to be a party to it. Well, so the Supreme Court allowed that to happen and basically sent out a letter saying, as the Supreme Court, they have their own bylaws. We don't have any place to say anything in inter-party conflicts, because it's a private party, basically. And so the Supreme Court dismissed it, so the local court had to dismiss it as well. Now that we've got most of the legal challenges completed, we now have fundraising pouring into the state. We have a new executive director. We have new staff that has been hired for the state party. We also, back in August of 2018, they stopped sending us $10,000 a month for maintenance, which the DNC sends to every single state party. And so they had not been paying us for a year and a half or whatever, or however many months it is. And so once the legal issues got completed, the DNC started sending us that $10,000 a month every month. And then they also gave us the entire back pay that had been saved up basically for the entire time. So we are in a very good place financially for a state like Alabama. We hardly ever get any donations or anything. And now we have money just pouring in. People saying we finally just need a functional state party. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing for them.
All that is fascinating, and it's something that we've been talking about for quite some time. And all this is a fight about power. So we have one final clip that Selena's brought to us. So go ahead.
Let me. And I just want to say too, the other thing, Julia, talk about the new people, all the new people who came onto the committee and what that's meant. Because I think that's really significant.
Oh, it is definitely. So I had mentioned before with the rewrites of the bylaws, the DNC needed us to be in compliance for minority representation, that it's not just Black people that need to be represented, which are very important, but it's also all the other minorities, Native American, Hispanic, Asian, Island Pacificer, LGBTQ, and the Youth Caucus. We had a meeting where we established new caucuses for each of those different organizations or different groups. They nominated representation within their own caucus, and that was brought to and added to the SDEC to give full representation to each and every single minority group. And within that is also built into the bylaws that the Black representation does not lose at all whatsoever. So within the LGBTQ group and the youth group, for example, they still have to have 70% Black representation within that minority group. So we now have full representation across the board per the bylaws, and it's written into there. So we're pretty set right now.
What a great story. Shall we show the clip on the power grab now?
You can, or it might be, if you want to wait till after we do the slides, I think that it would be good to do it at that time as well.
Okay. Well, why don't we switch to the slides? So what Selena's prepared is a set of slides that walks us through the bylaws and the charter of the Democratic Party and shows exactly where they were out of compliance and then what they had to do to become into compliance. So I'll turn this over to you, Selena.
Okay. Well, so if you want to, I'll put up the first slide. And what I want to say is for people who get really frustrated with the Democratic Party, is that there is a path to reform, and Alabama is the poster child for that, and that there really is. And the other thing that I really want people to know is that asking people in power to do the right thing, sometimes it works, but very often it does not work. And so understanding the rules and the process are really important. One of the most important things that people could read is the charter, and this. There's lots of, people really do not know how good the DNC rules are. They're very, very, now, believe me, there's some that I would like to change, but they're really, for the most part, are very good rules. The problem is they're not followed. In the charter, this is Article 8, and it has to do with full participation. So think about this. Think about in your Democratic Party, whether that's your, the national party, the state party, your local committees, your precincts, full participation. What that means, having notice, proper and effective notice of meetings. It means knowing when elections are so that people have an opportunity to run for leadership positions. And it means being present and being able to participate in the formulation of policy. Now, if you're not an elected member, you might not be able to vote on that policy. But if there's a policy that is to be voted on, that should be public information, so that if I'm a Democrat and I don't like this policy, or really like this policy, I need to be able to contact my representative and talk to them about it ahead of time, to, so I can participate in the formulation of that policy. All right, next slide. All right, section 2. This is really important because it lays out that discrimination is absolutely prohibited in the Democratic Party. Now, it includes the normal things that you would think of. You can't discriminate on, race and religion and sex and things like that. But there are things in here that are really, really important to know. Age. They cannot discriminate on age. Well, how many times are youth in the Democratic Party, and youth is considered voting age through 35, are discriminated against? Oh, well, you're a young person, you don't vote, you go away, let us older people take care of things. Or they're kind of coddled, and if you, we'd really, really love to have the youth involved as long as you fall in line with what we want, but as far as being fully participate in the process, very often they're discriminated against. Another one that we don't think about is economic status, right? I was in a meeting probably about 2 years ago. It was a Federation of Democratic Women. Well, it was the West Virginia Democratic Women. And there was a speaker at the table who was talking about how many people, the Bernie people, all the influx of new people involved that Bernie Sanders brought into the party. And so this woman, who is a leader in the West Virginia Democratic Party, she's on the executive committee. She's a leader in the Democratic Women. I was behind her. She leaned over to her friend and she said, "Yes, but they didn't bring any money with them." Right? So, things like that. People, that's a true story. So people can really get discriminated against based on their economic status. And of course, there's a disability, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, next slide. Now, this right here is the key to how Alabama fixed in terms of their bylaws, what they did. So what this Section 3 does is it says that the Democratic Party, all levels, state, national, they have to have an affirmative action program with and it says shall. Whenever you see shall, that's really important. It says that they shall adopt an affirmative action program to end up providing for representation. Now, that's really important to know too, representation. It goes from participation to representation. It's one thing to be able to go, if you're LGBTQ, to go and sit and listen, but it's another thing to have representation. All right, so that's really, really important. And also it defines that representation is indicated by their presence in the Democratic electorate. Okay, so and I'll show you that in a bit how that works out. All right, next slide, please. So what Alabama did, they had, and Julia is a member of their SDEC, that's the State Democratic Executive Committee, right? So they have elections and they are voted on, and they have this base of 210 members. Next slide. All right, so then she mentioned the Minority Caucus back in, I think, the early 90s, because African Americans did not have enough representation on the executive committee. There was like a federal lawsuit, and ended up being settled. And what they, she used it 70%. I thought it was 60%, so I apologize for that. But basically, the Minority Caucus, this settlement came out of it, that they had a Minority Caucus. So if you were an African American, you could join the Minority Caucus, and then that caucus would elect, and it should have been nominated, but what ended up happening is they basically elect African Americans to ensure that there would be a certain percentage, whatever that Democratic electorate was, 60-70% of the African American representation on that executive committee. So of the 210, once those were elected, let's say 50% of them were African American, then the Minority Caucus, whatever that number would be to put them up to 60 or 70%, then they got to nominate them. And then what ended up towards at least as recent of 2018, is that they basically, they just elected them, that they chose them and put on there, that not even the full membership voted on that. All right. So that was your total executive committee members. All right. Next slide.
So can I just say the percentage is based off of the participation in the last major election. So it's a moving target sometimes. It depends on how many people actually vote in the last election.
Thank you. Good point. So under that formula that they had of your base plus your minority caucus who added on there, but what about these other underrepresented groups? And the DNC basically has 7 defined underrepresented groups. One of them is African Americans. The others are Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander, LGBTQ youth, which is voting age through 35, disabled, and Native American. All right. So what was going on in one of the key challenges is in Alabama, and believe me, this happens probably in every state. But what happened in Alabama is what happened if you were Hispanic? If you were not in that base of 210, if you were not elected and didn't, you had no representation. All right. Same thing with each of these other groups, LGBTQ. If you were not elected, you had no representation. All right, next slide. Okay, and this comes back exactly. We need to have representation as indicated by the presence in the Democratic electorate. Next slide. All right, so here's each of these groups. Now, to be fair, this chart is not to scale, but at the time that their bylaws and was getting worked on last summer and last fall, the number for African Americans was 60.4% in the Democratic electorate, and youth, whatever, that slide's not big enough for me to really read, but 26%, yeah. Disabled 16, LGBTQ 7%, Hispanic 1.1, Asian American, it was 0.7, and then only 0.2% of Native American. Okay, next slide. So what they decided to do was, or what they wanted to do, is to have each of these, if they were to have representation equal to their participation in the Democratic electorate, then the youth, you would take 26.4% and times that by the base number of 210, and then that was 55 youth. All right. And then they did that with each one of these other groups to figure out what was the number of people in these underrepresented groups that should be on the executive committee. All right. Next slide, please. So for instance, in the youth, you needed to have 55. But if there already were a certain number in that group, in the base group, then you would subtract that. So for instance, in the youth, there were of the 210, 30 of them were already youth. So you didn't need to add, you just subtracted 30 from the 55, and that was 25. And so then you had off to the right, you can do the next slide. So then you would only need to add 25 more youth to have the representation as it is in the Democratic electorate. And so those numbers off to the right: 25 youth, 9 disabled, 10 LGBTQ, 2 Hispanic, 1 Asian American, Pacific Islander, and then unfortunately, the way the percentage worked out, no Native Americans. But that ended up meaning that they needed to add 63 new members from the underrepresented groups that they were needed if they were to have this appropriate representation. Next slide, please. So Julia talked about these caucuses. So what they did is they built into their bylaws these different caucuses. Now, the disabled caucus, I don't know all the specifics of it, but there were some issues with, I think, defining and, I think that it gets a little bit more complicated. Is it a physical disability? Is it a mental disability? It's my understanding it can be both. But anyway, they decided that they needed more time to kind of figure out what the disabled caucuses look like. So they kind of deferred that to this year, and it'll be interesting to see how they end up doing that. But they went ahead and they initiated, can you go back to that slide? Yeah. So they had the Youth Caucus, LGBT Caucus, Hispanic, and Asian American Pacific Islander. And basically what this caucus means is that if you are a Democrat in Alabama and you fit into one of these categories, you can be a member of the caucus. All right. So any youth, you don't have to run for anything. If you are a youth, by that definition, you can say, I want to be in the Youth Caucus. Same thing with each of the other ones. So then those caucuses, they knew that they needed to have 25, that they needed to nominate 25 youth for the SDEC. So they had a meeting. They had to be equally divided between men and women. And as Julia said, a certain percentage of them, I think 60 or 70%, also had to be African American to not throw those numbers off. So that's what they did. And that's how they ended up getting 63 diverse new people onto their executive committee, and in a ways that they never had before. So all of a sudden you had this influx of really energized people with diversity onto their executive committee. And it really changed the game. Next slide, please. So as we talked before, and I keep stressing, this is all possible because of challenges. I happen to know from getting to know Julia and some of the other challengers that they had tried to get, it's not like this just happened in 2018 that they started having problems. That they had for years been trying to have more representation on the executive committee and to do reform, and had not had any luck whatsoever. And so through the filing of successful challenges, they were able to make the change. And I do want to be clear, they were in a really good position because they had Doug Jones on their side. Having the rules on your side is one thing. Having the rules and the politics on your side are even better. And so, I'm certainly not going to imply that these challenges are easy. They are not. But it is a way to do reform. I think this would be a good time to play that. Well, I don't want to mess up the slide thing. We'll play the power grab in just a minute, but go ahead to the next slide. So how do you file a challenge? I'm just going to tell you, it's not easy. I've filed 3. My first one was, I worked and worked and worked. I was in the hospital and left the hospital to come home to make sure that I got my timeline, that I wasn't late on it. But my first challenge was dismissed because I didn't turn in a certificate of service. I didn't know what a certificate of service was at that time, but basically it's just a piece of paper that says, I filed and served this on the parties. That's all it says. It's not even notarized. But because I didn't include that, it was dismissed, and it was really important things in there. So I've since, learned what a certificate of service was and filed 2 challenges that are now pending with the Rules and Bylaws Committee. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, those will be accepted and will move West Virginia towards change. But these documents are documents that you would need. The charter and bylaws of the Democratic Party, the delegate selection rules, especially very much you have a lot of leverage in terms of delegate selection. Every state and territory has to have a delegate selection plan, and your state party needs to follow that to the T. And if they don't, you could have implementation challenges. The way that they pick delegates, there are things in there that are really important to know. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but anyway, knowing those delegate selection rules are important. The call to the convention is important. The regulations of the Rules and Bylaws Committee, there's a lot of good information about challenges in that. And then whatever your state party bylaws are. Now, there's also, I believe, kind of like a regulations to the Credentials Committee as well. And I don't have that. If anybody has that, I'd like to have that. But I think that as well, because I know that the challenge that Julia was part of, it was a challenge that went to the Credentials Committee, not to Rules and Bylaws Committee. Mine have only went to Rules and Bylaws Committee. All right, next slide. All right, and this is, I just wanted to show you, I mentioned this before, these are not new rules. This is, that on the left was the paper from, I think, 1974, when they, the Democratic Party first developed their charter. And in it is this section on full participation. And it says right there, as defined by the bylaws of the aforementioned groups, as indicated by their presence in the Democratic electorate. This is not a new thing. I put on social media, I think it was the Dem Inner Facebook page, and asked several questions, like 5 questions about equal division, about notice, about having groups represented in, related to the Democratic electorate. I mean, I had state party chairs. I mean, the smart state party chairs indicate that they did not meet all of these requirements. I don't know that they know that they're requirements, but these are rights. These are rights of Democrats to have appropriate representation on your state party and on your national party. And I think that it's important that we make issue of it, that we talk about it, and that when it's appropriate to file a challenge and to kind of demand that if your state party or your local party will not guarantee you the rights that are given to you by the charter, that we ask the DNC to make sure that our rights are respected.
Can we show the clip? And then we'll talk about power.
Well, let me do this. One more. I think there's one more slide. Let me just say something about it.
Okay.
So I mentioned about income, discrimination earlier. This is a really nice. This is an Article 2, Section 11 of the bylaws, and people probably don't know this. I didn't know it until I started digging. But state parties shall carry out programs to facilitate and increase participation of low and moderate income persons. Did you know that? I mean, they have to. It's shall. These programs shall include provisions and resources for outreach and recruitment to achieve, again, representation and equally equitably minimize economic factors which act to bar full participation by such persons. So that's a requirement that state parties have some kind of program to help low and moderate income persons participate. All right, yes, let's go to the power grab video.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Shall is used through all these. Why isn't it must?
That's what it means. Shall means must, and should means, you should do it, but if you don't, it's not the end of the world. But whenever they use the word shall, that means must.
Okay, so may is a weasel word then. So shall and must. Okay, so when they have may in there, because I've seen may too many times. So, okay, I'm going to set up the clip. Just give me a few seconds.
But this is, the long and the short of this is a power grab. This is plain and simple. This is not about race. This is about power. And the fact is that now, having ignored the diversity constituencies, decade after decade after decade, now that they are coming into being, Dr. Reed wants to grab them. But
so the power that he's talking about, and we talk about this a lot. In any democratically run organization, the power starts with the membership, and the membership allocates power to its leadership as it sees necessary. And so, there's things that it's convenient to let the leadership do. You don't want to approve, the purchase of staples by the membership, and so in the bylaws is where you transfer power from the membership to the leadership. But what they're talking about here is where the leadership has become egregious and they are taking more power than they are allocated. Anything else you'd like to say about that, Selena or Julia?
Julia, why don't you talk about the specifics of that in terms of Joe Reed, and I'll talk about it in sort of like a big picture thing.
Okay, so Dr. Reed is the vice chair of Minority Affairs. He's the one that actually filed the federal lawsuit back in the 90s to ensure accurate representation of Black participation within the SDEC. So in that time, when they filed that federal lawsuit, they got a consent decree, which has actually been misread and misinterpreted, but everybody just kind of let it go. It's supposed to form a task force to ensure accurate representation of all minorities, but it was taken and assumed to mean Black representation only. So it's been used to enforce the at-large seats, the addition of Black representation on the SDEC, but has rejected using or adding any at-large seats for any other minorities. This has helped create a very powerful voting bloc within the SDEC of people on the minority caucus that follow Dr. Reed's leadership. He's very involved in picking who gets appointed to those at-large seats, and if it's highly recommended that people follow his directions and his leadership, no matter what that is or no matter what it looks like, because they know that they have a very powerful voting bloc of representatives on the SDEC. So with the addition of the additional minority caucus members to the SDEC, it diversifies and spreads out some of that power a lot more and gives the opportunity to have other people have a voice in what goes on with the state party. Where previously, and Selena had mentioned this earlier, there are people that have been working on trying to make reforms within the party for decades now, that because Dr. Reed had this very powerful voting bloc, anything that they wanted to pass was just voted down. And I mean, it's within the rules that they can vote it down because you have enough people voting for or against something. But so that's why there have been people fighting for so long, but no reforms actually coming through, because that's not the way that Dr. Reed wanted to push the power within the party, because it didn't benefit him in any way. So, for example, if there was an empty SDEC seat at an SDEC meeting, any member can nominate somebody to be appointed into that seat, and then the full body gets to vote up or down. Do we add them or we do not add them? And this was actually the way I originally was added to the SDEC. And at the time, they didn't know who I was. So they were like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I think they would probably vote against me now if they knew any better. But I actually got elected to my seat this past election cycle. But there are times that they would have people that they wanted to add to SDEC seats, and there was no reason to vote against them. But Dr. Reed decided that he didn't want them on there for whatever reason. And he's like, nope, we're not going to vote for that. And so all of the people that follow his leadership would just sit down and not vote for this person. And it's been very, very blatant and talked about for a long time about the power that Dr. Reed wields within the party and within politics in general in Alabama, Democratic politics within the state of Alabama. And one way that he does that is with the power of the SDEC and who he can put support behind, or who he can take support away from and have people actively working against elected officials and things like that.
What a great story. So thank you so much for hanging in there. I know that it feels awkward when you get all the negativity for stirring up things and trying to affect change and trying to make things more democratic. But thank you so much for hanging in there.
I've gotten yelled at a lot. I get yelled at. They voted me out of a couple meetings because they're like, she's recording too much, she's talking too much, she's not allowed to be in here. So it's been interesting. It's been a learning experience. I have very tough skin now.
Yeah, as the saying goes, democracy is not a spectator sport. And
very true. It's very much contact.
Yeah. And the reason why we're in this situation we are now is because we thought everything was fine, and we trusted our leadership, and so in 2016 was when we started to realize that perhaps we we took our eye off the ball, and we've let too much power slip out of our hands and be usurped by the leadership. And so that's why we are working to take some of that power back. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Just read your bylaws. Like Selena's been saying, like most of the stuff that's in there is actually really good stuff. Like there were some very intentional, good-minded people that built these bylaws from the beginning, and they put a lot of these provisions already in there. It's just like you were saying, we all stopped reading bylaws and we stopped going to meetings and we stopped giving a shit about what they were doing because we're like, they have our best interests at heart, right? No, they don't. They have their own interests at heart. And if we want to know that we're being represented and taken care of, we need to actively be involved in that. And that includes the really boring shit like going to meetings and recording those meetings and reading the bylaws and reading what they're putting out, because it's written in that they have to tell us what they're doing. It's just that nobody reads it. Nobody's like caring what they're doing on our behalf. Well, you have to you have to care, you have to pay attention. Otherwise, they're just going to tromp all over us again and again and again.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Selena?
Well, I completely agree with everything that Julia said. And, and I'd like to kind of make a big picture statement about that power grab. And that was they were very specifically talking about, they were debating the bylaws and what was going to go in the bylaws. And what Mr. Ickes was saying about that particular thing was the suggestion that Joe Reed had. It was a complete power grab. He wanted control over all these new people coming in. But the big picture thing about that is that's what happens. I mean, people in power, they want to stay in power. And the people who write the bylaws, they're going to write the bylaws to benefit them. And it's so important to show up and to really understand that that people in power I'm not going to say everybody, but people in power are not going to just give up power. You have to show up. You have to run and like Julia did, run and get elected into positions and really follow things so that you are doing reform and that you are helping people have appropriate representation. If you don't, then there's no sense in we don't need you in the Democratic Party. And I'd also like to say, I think that for the most part, there are people who are on these committees do have good intentions, but they tend to go along with power. I mentioned earlier the West Virginia Democratic Party is corrupt. There is a handful of corrupt people. Most people are just followers. They don't read the bylaws. They don't pay attention. So to get involved, run for these party positions, and let's reform the party from the ground up.
Yes, there's two facets of this. There's the bylaws, which are your governing documents, and it is important to know those. The other thing that is important for everyone to know is what their rights are in a democracy. And so this is where you get to study parliamentary procedure. And everyone thinks it's really boring, but it is really boring until you find your rights taken away. And then suddenly it becomes a very interesting subject matter to you, but they are very complicated. But what they are rules where your rights are protected at some level. So you have the right to vote, you have the right to attend meetings, you have the right to debate, and it is your right to receive meeting notices unless these rights have been given away, and you can see how much has been given away in your bylaws. So if they haven't been given away, you can assert them. If your rights have been given away in your bylaws, then you need to start work to bringing those back. So how to learn about parliamentary procedure? There is an organization called the National Association of Parliamentarians, and they have educational programs where you can learn. There are chapters in many urban areas across the United States, and so if you are in one where there's a local chapter, and this is of interest to you, I urge you to join them. It's a great group of people. They're basically nonpartisan, and they're really just about how democracy works, and is a way for you to learn what your rights are and how to assert them. The other thing that we're doing is that there is an organization now called People for Democratic Party Reform. We have people from all over the United States that are joining us, and what we are doing is working at several levels. So we are reviewing the bylaws of the DNC, and we will be proposing some reforms to that. We will help any state party which is in a situation like Alabama was, where either you're having trouble with the getting the rules enforced properly or being treated properly and your rights respected in the party. We can help you learn how to assert that. And then if there are changes that need to be made, we have people that are parliamentarians who know how to write bylaws and get those things changed. If you would like to join that movement, the website is pdpr.org, and there's a button on there that you can click to join up, and we would love to have you join us in our effort, because it's really going to take all of us from all the states and territories working together to get these changes implemented. If you would like to follow me at Twitter, my Twitter handle is _PDPR. And if you have questions about PDPR, you can send them to info at pdpr.org. And if for some reason that email is rejected, try again tomorrow, because there might be something I have to fix there. Was there any questions on the line, Oz, for us to answer?
Yeah, they were coming and going. I did have one from Human asked if there was a Robert's Rules app. I believe it was the question. Is there an app for parliamentary procedure?
Unfortunately, no. There is you can get Robert's Rules of Order, which is the predominant parliamentary authority used in the United States. You can get that on a DVD, or you can get that on a CD, which is an easier way to search for it. But really, it's a subject matter where it really helps to meet with people who understand the subject, the subject matter, and can work through some of these issues, because so much of our rights have been taken away, and people have a tendency to do what they are told and not assert their rights, that they don't even know when their rights are being taken away from them. So it's been a journey for myself over the last decade of really understanding how my rights have been taken away and what I need to do to get them back in my own state. So the best thing to do is go to the National Association of Parliamentarians website, which is parliamentarians.org, and you can find your local chapter there. If you want to join the National Association of Parliamentarians, the process is laid out there. If you do not have a chapter in your local area that you can attend, there's a couple of virtual groups, including mine, which is the Cascadia study group, and it's a group that gets together and studies different aspects of parliamentary procedure and democracy every month, and we would love to have you join us. I'm going to do a plug for my show. So I have a TV show called Parliamentary Talk, and it's where we take situations and examine them, and then find out where parliamentary law and democracy, the rules of democracy, have been violated, and then we talk about how to correct those situations. We have one on a neighborhood association where the leadership was ignoring the membership, and so we talked about how that can be rectified. And as I was saying earlier, this issue becomes very, very interesting when you find out that your rights are being withdrawn and you don't know how to get it back. So go to parliamentarians.org. You can find any of the local groups, including a listing for mine there. Anything else that anyone would like to add before we sign off today?
Well, I just want to say thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about, and I just think the Alabama story is a great story, and it's something that anybody interested in reform should know about. And it gives me hope about the challenges that I've filed, even though I don't have a senator behind me. But thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for starting the People for Democratic Party Reform. It's very much needed, and want to just really, really show appreciation for the work that you're doing. And Julia, thank you for everything that you've done.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Oz, that concludes our show. If we have outgoing music, go ahead and play that and click through our final slides. Otherwise, we are done.
At the forefront
172 voted yes to remove Nancy as chair, 0 opposed.